Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2022. And that brings us to that title, which has been designated by Criterion at spine number 1140. This is the work from the year 1972. The name of the director is Sidney Poitier, and the name of the film is Buck and the Preacher. This is the great work from the year 1972, and among its really exceptional cast, we have people like Ruby Dee and Cameron Mitchell, and of course we have Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, who are on screen or in front of the camera coming together with this brilliant, so lovable and quite a complex duo, a combination of characters with great on-screen chemistry on the one hand, but also we understand that behind the camera, in terms of the production, this is also a creative and cinematic collaboration between these two artists who are coming together and trying to make this story. And indeed, this is also, yes, we understand, a very strong artistic collaboration between these two great artists, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. And of course, Sidney Poitier is or became the director of this film. That is Buck and the Preacher. So there's a lot to say about the production details that emerge and are discussed in the great set of supplements that we find included in this Criterion release. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the latter half of this video discussion. But before we get to there, my friends, let us first talk about this film and let's try to talk about the plot or story structure of this film. It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's so entertaining, and it has so many levels that are operating both in terms of a reflection of the times, the contemporary times of in which it was made, the early 1970s, as well as having echoes or resonances that are very relevant, to a watch of this film in the year 2022, and I dare say beyond. So timeless, as well as very strongly linked to its own contemporary times, as well as being an thoroughly entertaining Western film. So with all that, the plot or story structure, I think, can be described as focusing in on a number of main characters, one of which is the character of Buck. This is the Sidney Poitier character. And we understand that his mission or his story involves protecting and guiding and leading the way for a group of recently emancipated African Americans who are trying to travel from east to west to the new frontier. These are frontiers people, and their journey out west needs to be guided along by a character like Buck, but also they need to be protected by a character like Buck, because along the way, not only are they confronting certain aspects of the frontier, the wild frontier and nature and the environmental surroundings, but also in terms of a direct correlation or direct aspect of the plot, they also have to worry about the very dangerous threat that is posed by the bounty hunters, as represented by the character portrayed by Cameron Mitchell, and also his crew, his gang, that are out to stop these people, that are out to get these people, and they pose a very dangerous threat to this group of travelers who are trying, in essence, to escape to a new life after having been recently emancipated from slavery. So this is the sort of backdrop against which the character of Buck, the Sidney Poitier character, comes in as a type of endeavoring to protect these people from this threat or menace that is being posed. That is one aspect, or that is one main character, because as the title says, it is Buck and the preacher. So one character is Buck. The other character is, of course, the preacher, played with such a type of a lovable menace, or a menacing, loving way, by Harry Belafonte. And this is, we have their uneasy relationship, that between Buck and the preacher. Are they friends or are they foes? It's not quite clear, and indeed that uneasy relationship adds to a sense of tension and suspense, as well as comic relief, as well as that real high level of entertainment value. Because one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which I think this film is so engaging, is seeing these two actors play off of each other, and we have the comparison and contrast delineated so nicely and so clearly from the very get-go. We have a type of say, reserved stoicism that one can say is being displayed in terms of the character of Buck on the one hand, in the hands of the performance by Sidney Poitier, and then we have this sense of almost an unexpected type of untamed quality that is being portrayed and encapsulated by the great performance by Harry Belafonte in terms of the preacher character on the other. And this combination could be said to be volatile. It could be said to be quite menacing and unexpected. It could be said to be quite surprising and maybe even shocking. It also could be said to be potentially very heroic and very much in need. One needs the other. And indeed, that might be the case, because as the stakes become heightened, and as the threat, the external threat, as posed by these bounty hunters and Cameron Mitchell character and others, and what they represent, has the threats and as the stakes become more and more heightened, as they become indeed life and death stakes, we see that Buck and the preacher perhaps need each other more than they realize. And indeed, maybe they need each other to the point where they will work together. And that uneasy relationship turning into that type of really great character dynamic, that great sense of on-screen chemistry that these performers, these actors have. And there is a sense of a history between the performers and actors, and indeed that history and that friendship and that bond is described in great detail in some of the Criterion supplements. That is also a type of reflection in how we as viewers can read and interpret and indeed engage with this film, because we understand that their duo, their combination, is part of the reason why the film then operates on such a high level, and how the plot is propelled forward, and also how then in turn it becomes such an engaging, fun, and really dynamic Western that is, again, contemporary and also timeless at the same time. And that is due in large part to the great likability of the characters and performances, and how they play off of each other, and the great chemistry between them. It's one of the great partnerships, on-screen partnerships, that we see in any Western, let alone in terms of a cinema from the 1970s. So it's a great collaboration, both on-screen and behind the camera. And the on-screen chemistry between these two performers is absolutely fantastic. And I say on-screen chemistry, I mean, we also have to include the great chemistry that is shared between and among Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, and also Ruby Dee. Ruby Dee's performance here is it's great. Her character, Ruth, it has a type of a way in which it might be said to be falling within certain parameters of, say, dynamics of the Western genre on the one hand, but then at the same time, it maybe turns those dynamics on its head and creates a character that is very fully realized, very three-dimensional, and indeed very active and very much part of the party, and very much on equal footing in a lot of ways, in a lot of great and refreshing ways, I might add. So that is another aspect of this film that I think is very telling and very much cutting edge in a remarkable and a brilliant way. Another way too that we can describe this film, Buck and the Preacher, is if we're thinking about it in terms of the context of the social political climate, there is the way in which this film is attempting to portray race relations and also the the African American experience as portrayed or within the context of Buck and the Preacher, Ruth, and also the frontiers people that are part of this group that is trying to essentially migrate out from the east to the west. And so we have the race relations that are depicted in terms of the characters of, say, Cameron Mitchell and also some of the townspeople that they meet. Sometimes they can be quite belligerent, can be quite confrontational, quite dangerous, and so that is an aspect of the race relations between the certain characters on one end of the spectrum and other characters on another end of the spectrum. So this is, I think, meant also to parallel or echo the type of race relations and climate that can be said, or that is described in the 1970s, and how this is linked to the efforts and the endeavors by Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte and others in their own personal and professional pursuits in the context of civil rights in the United States during the 60s and 70s. So this is, I think, paralleling that background, reality and fiction, paralleling each other in a very powerful way. And indeed, in a direct way too, because the confrontations between in the context of race relations is very it's very confrontational, and it's very shocking, and it leads to some quite intense action scenes that have a deal of that lead to sense of maybe violence, and also a sense of inequity, and also a sense of the unfairness of certain situations, but also how characters like Buck and the Preacher and Ruth and others, how they deal with it in their own way, in a way that can be said to be quite noble. It can also be said to be quite almost heroic, and also could be said to be quite strategic and very intelligent as well, and also dealing with, say, perceptions of race in a way that is also trying to turn it to their advantage. So it's a very interesting dynamic in terms of race relations in one aspect of that phrase. Another aspect of the race relations or the relations between certain race or ethnic groups can also be described in the aspect of the film dealing with the connections between the African American characters and the Native American characters that we also meet in this film. And this dynamic is also very complex too. It's a relationship or dynamic that does have its bumps in the road. It does have some rocky parts to it. It's not a wholly easy relationship. And indeed, this is acknowledged both in terms of how the story presents this relationship, as well as how the film represents this relationship. And I think the supplements of the Criterion release, especially the discussion with scholar and academic Mia Mask, I think is really helpful in this regard, and we'll talk about that later in this video. But that is also another reason why I think this film has a certain contemporary edge in terms of trying to provide these representations in the form of a work of Hollywood cinema in the early 1970s, and also too in the context of a Western film, and a Western film with African American characters in the center, which was something that maybe had been seen in past examples of cinema dating back from, say, the 1930s into 1940s. But in terms of this type of Hollywood expression of Western cinema that can be said to found type of prominence in Hollywood cinema settings from the 1950s onwards. I mean, this type of film with African American characters, also directed by African American Sidney Poitier, and also the artistic collaboration between African Americans Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. This is one of the reasons why this film has a resonance and power, and indeed Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte acknowledge this as being one of the reasons why they wanted to make this film, in order to present this dynamic of the Western from the vantage point and perspective, and indeed the central location of these African American characters, Buck and the Preacher, and also the characters that we meet along the way, Ruth and the others. So in that way, it becomes a very important film in the context of civil rights and social and political, say, race relations and tensions and such, as well as representations in cinema and Western genre and Hollywood cinema, as well as being a great showcase for the wonderful performances by Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte and Ruby Dee and others. I mean, their performances are electrifying and dynamic, and it's one of the great duos. I mean, we understand from many examples of, say, Western cinema, one of the great examples of Western cinema, or one of the great traits of wonderful Western cinema is you have the duo or the pair of our heroes. And this is a great example of that. This is another great duo or pair in a Western film. And indeed, that power and dynamic of this pairing makes for really entertaining cinema indeed. And that's also something that should be emphasized too. This is a really entertaining film. There are action set pieces that are stunning. There are moments of comedy that are really funny. There are moments of tension that are really tense. There are moments of sudden confrontation that are very confrontational, and all on to serve the purpose of this film, which is ultimately to entertain and to guide and to teach, and ultimately to provide a sense of a full cinematic experience. And so I think we get that in very, very healthy and very large helpings indeed in the form of this film, Buck and the Preacher. What a great film this is, again, operating on many levels, and also, and perhaps ultimately, being such an entertaining and absorbing and engaging film from this great collaboration of Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. What a great film this is. What a great entry into the Criterion collection this is. This is the film which is Buck and the Preacher. The Criterion Collection has released this film, Buck and the Preacher, on this Blu-ray edition, which is at SPY number 1140. And I've taken the liberty of, or I've already removed the leaflet or the insert or the fold-out prior to the start of recording this video. And one of the reasons is to talk about the transfer as it's described in this insert. So Buck and the Preacher was restored by Sony Pictures Entertainment and is presented in its original aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. This new digital transfer was created in 4K resolution on a laser graphics director film scanner from the 35mm original camera negative. The monaural soundtrack was remastered from the 3-track dialogue, music, and effects track with the original soundtrack negative as a reference, and completed at Blue Wave Audio in Los Angeles. Okay, so we have this 4K resolution new digital transfer. So, I admit I don't have a strong frame of reference when it comes to this film in terms of my experience with this film. But that notwithstanding, watching this film in this Criterion release with this Blu-ray edition, I was very entertained. I was totally absorbed by the film. And part of that is the look and feel of the film. I mean, this is a Western film in terms of, and it's very proudly a Western film in terms of the way that the setting, the outdoor locations, the sky and the rock and the land, how these presented, and the colors, the blue sky and the sort of the red-brown earth tones of the dirt and the rocks, as well as the way in which this rough landscape is being presented in these visual terms, the rugged nature of the environment as it's compared or contrast to, say, the close-ups of the faces of the characters, and how that really has a sense of a visual dynamism that serves the film very well. And this is, I think, reflected in how the lines and the contours and the contrasts and the colors are really preserved. They feel, at least to my my own subjective viewpoint, to be very much preserved in a way that is very absorbing and very beautiful, and very much something to be appreciated and to be enjoyed in terms of the look, aesthetic, and feel and sound. And so I was very impressed. I'm very happy with this, and I'm. What can I say? It's another great presentation, I think, from a Criterion release. So this is Buck and the Preacher and the 4K resolution presentation, both in terms of the look and also the monaural soundtrack sound. So now with as per usual with the Criterion releases, we also have a set of supplements that can be found together with this release of Buck and the Preacher. You go to the supplements menu and you can find the supplements there. So what are those supplements? So the first supplement that's included is one that's called Expanding the Western, The Road to Buck and the Preacher. And this is described as being from 2022, approximately 24 minutes. This is a one-on-one discussion with Mia Mask, who is a scholar, an academic, an expert, a critic, and also a fan and admirer of Buck and the Preacher. And then she also acknowledges that she discovered this film somewhat, relatively speaking, recently in her own cinema journey. And that's one of the things that she points out in a very fascinating way, how this film, in many ways, it maybe isn't a film that has always been part of the conversation when it comes to, say, quote unquote, the classics of the Western genre of the 1970s, which films have been repeated a lot and have been discussed a lot in the same breadth of that conversation. Buck and the Preacher, she acknowledges here, maybe hasn't always been part of that conversation. And that's not due to anything lacking in the content. I mean, on the contrary, she acknowledges the greatness of the film on many levels. She also acknowledges a number of say, potential maybe weaknesses or critiques that one can make, and we'll get to that momentarily. But be that as it may, there is an argument to be made, a very strong one to be made, that this film, Buck and the Preacher, should be mentioned in the same breath, in the same pantheon of quote-unquote great works of cinema from the 1970s, great Western works from the 1970s. So, and I think her comments, I think, in this conversation really help to formulate that type of thesis and argument in a very persuasive way. So part of her discussion here, Mia Mask's conversation here, is also talking about the background and careers of Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, because again, it's this combination of these two artists that is in many ways one of the key aspects of the story Buck and the Preacher. And that's because of the way in which their on-screen chemistry is formed, but also how this film ended up being made in the first place, and the collaboration and the connection and the way in which their lives essentially intersected. And there was a point when they kind of broke off as well. There was a sort of falling out between the two men, as Mia Mask describes, but then they came back together. And when they came back together, this was the opportunity for them to collaborate in this great artistic way that they could be proud of. The end result was Buck and the Preacher. So there are some details of their careers respectively leading up to this great collaboration. There's also mentioning of, for example, the American Negro Theater and how this was a very important part of, for example, Harry Belafonte and his entry into the world of theater, and also then the world of music, and also how this was also means by which he was able to meet Sidney Poitier, who also had a very similar interests in terms of theater and acting. And also they had similar backgrounds and similar, say, biographical details in terms of where they came from and where they grew up. And also they described to, or Mia Mask describes to, how part of their journey in terms of their careers and artistic endeavors also was, unfortunately, having to deal with what is described as a type of racism on an institutional level. And so they had to deal with this. And this may be through certain events of their lives that have been documented. This also could be said to be leading to their participation and interest and enthusiasm for the promotion of civil rights in the United States and the civil rights movement, and their growth, respectively, as artists, and in terms of their popularity. For instance, Sidney Poitier and his rise to stardom in terms of being a box office draw and a Hollywood star and an Academy Award winning actor. and then Harry Belafonte being the the top singer and the number one draw in terms of a musician, as well as showing the multifaceted talents that he has as a musician, a singer, and also an actor. And so, both in terms of movies and also theater, etc. So we have the collaboration and combination of these two. That, in terms of an artistic front, they have many similarities, but also they bring their own talents to the table very effectively. But also in terms of the professional, personal, and also political, they have the many interests that coincide in terms of their efforts to promote the civil rights movement in the United States. But Mia Mask also points out that in that context, there was a falling out between these two men, and in terms of how they were both trying to perceive certain plans regarding a protest or overnight vigil that was planned but was not realized because of certain disagreements that emerged between these two men. But after approximately 2 years of this falling out, Mia Mass describes the situation where Harry Belafonte, on his own his own career track, came up or discovered the story, the script or the story, Drake Walker, and decided or wanted to collaborate with Sidney Poitier. And so after this falling out between the two, Harry Belafonte tried to bridge the gap between them. And indeed, the gap was bridged in a way that was successful enough and friendly enough that they came together again. And not only did they come together again, but they came together both personally and professionally for the context of the production of this film, Buck and the Preacher. So, so many details emerging already. And indeed, those biographical details could be said also to be very much connected with a lot of the very potent themes that are part of Buck and the Preacher. For example, the way in which this film can be said to be a type of reflection of many modes of say, representations of race and race relations that have their links to real-life events as expressed through American civil rights. So this is, I think, very much, therefore, a film that is part of the, say, very character, the very heart and soul, if you will, of these performers, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. So it has that personal touch that is also very political, that is also very much Western and entertaining Western at that. So this discussion by Mia Mask, I think, is in terms of the production details and the road to Buck and the Preacher is very important and so illuminating and so enlightening, as well as some details that she brings up about the meaning of the word cowboy, and how maybe certain stories of, say, the West and the frontier, how a lot of the actual stories involving African Americans in this context form the basis for arguably for a lot of stories that emerged in Hollywood in terms of Hollywood Westerns. But those Hollywood Westerns were Westerns that were stories about white characters. And so it becomes this way of also showing the significance of Buck and the Preacher in the context of Hollywood cinema, and the way in which Hollywood cinema was representing and showing and telling stories of African American characters and the African American experience as expressed and lived through these characters, such as Buck and the Preacher. So this is a very, I think, important, I think, historical context, historical and cinematic context, cinematic historical context that Mia Mask is providing. Also, this idea of revisionist films in the 1950s, in terms of revisionism in the Western genre that led the way to films like Buck and the Preacher and others. So there's a way in which there's almost a feeling of the experimental, and also telling stories that have a psychological feel as well as a social, political, and culturally significant aspect to it. And so this is paving the way for the circumstances that will give rise to the environment and the Hollywood culture that would lead the way for the creation of the film Buck and the Preacher. And also there's discussion too of some production details details about how the director that was originally planned to be the director was not Sidney Poitier, but in fact Joseph Sargent. But due to certain circumstances, Joseph Sargent stepped away from the production. That left the director chair empty, and so it was decided between Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier that perhaps Sidney Poitier would be the ideal person to sit in the director's chair, even though perhaps he wasn't experienced as a director. He's acknowledged, or it's described, that he did have certain expertise as an actor in terms of observing how the sets were operated. He did have knowledge of lenses, and so there was a way in which there was a certain knowledge of the cinematography techniques and technological aspects of camera work that it would be useful for a director to know. So these sorts of things, of course, meant that he wasn't a total novice, but it was still something that he was very nervous about, because this was essentially his directorial debut. But it was a really successful turn, it's said, because I think it's acknowledged that his directorial style, indeed the aesthetic that Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier were seeking, was to turn this work not as a type of TV movie aesthetic, as it's described in this discussion here, but rather as a top-of-the-line, high-budget Western film that has all the traits of a Hollywood spectacle film, and indeed it is, because it's very entertaining with action set pieces and that really show off the beauty of the Western landscape. So this is a Hollywood film through and through, and I think Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte are really using that to their advantage to tell this very exciting and thrilling story that has a lot of social political undercurrents to it in a very profound way. So these are really great details. And indeed, too, Mia Mask talks about the importance and significance of Ruby Dee's character, Ruth. And there are scenes, for instance, where she is a part of the action. She's riding alongside the characters, part of certain set pieces involving, there's certain very key action set pieces where she's directly involved, etc. So she is very much a presence and very much an equal with regard to her relationship with Buck and the Preacher, respectively. So that is also, I think, a very significant aspect in terms of the character development, as well as the positioning of this film in a social, political, and cultural context. Also, in that way, Mia Mask does talk about the relationship between the Native American characters and the African American characters in this film. And the story does mention this phrase, buffalo soldiers, which is meant to remind the viewers that, and also the characters in the film, that the characters here, in particular, characters like Buck and the Preacher, or Buck, for example, might be in a very slightly complex situation, because on the one hand, in the context of the film, they are trying to seek the help and assistance of the Native American characters that they meet. However, they also have to acknowledge that their pasts have not always been very friendly. And indeed, this reference to buffalo soldiers is a reference to the fact that maybe soldiers, African-American soldiers, were in a position, in terms of their positioning in the army, to be antagonistic against Native American populations in the United States. And so this is acknowledged in the phrase buffalo soldiers. And this is actually spoken, referenced directly in terms of the dialogue between the characters in the film. So this is a very provocative moment. And it's meant, I think, to show that this type of alliance is not an easy one. Also, when we think about the way in which this was filmed, I think Mia Mask, very appropriately so, does remind us that the key character of Cincy is played by Julie Robinson Belafonte. And so this is an aspect of the filming that I think Mia Mask acknowledges as being somewhat troublesome, because this is an actor an actress who is portraying a character that is not the actor's actual ethnicity. And so there's a certain problematic nature to this aspect that some viewers might find, and indeed Mia Mask does acknowledge this as well. So it does try, the film does, to try to confront these uncomfortable aspects, and maybe it doesn't always succeed because of the fact that it is doing these or making these choices behind the camera that might seem to be quite antithetical to the types of ambitious thematic conclusions that the film content itself is trying to reach. With that being said, there is something to be celebrated about the type of content that this film embodies. And Mia Mask does do that, and she turns the conversation in that way to a celebration of this film and what it represents, and it's how it sits in the context of 1970s cinema and African American cinema, Hollywood cinema, and also the representations of the actors and performers such as Ruby Dee and Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and others, while also acknowledging its potential critiques along the way. It's still a magnificent film in terms of the way in which she argues it and presents it, and indeed her arguments and presentations are incredibly well presented and incredibly persuasive and very informative indeed. So this conversation with Mia Mask and she also, I should say too, she mentions the reception of the film. She describes how there were certain, say, African-American critics who and audiences who responded very positively to this film, but there were maybe other audiences, quote-unquote mainstream audiences that she describes as mainstream audiences that maybe had a lukewarm response to the film. But hopefully with releases like Criterion's, the response as the film, as the years pass, the stature of the film will be acknowledged and appreciated. So, and I think that is due in large part to great comments made by Mia Mask in this great conversation. So please check this out if you can. This is, again, the conversation with Mia Mask, approximately 24 minutes. And that's not all, because then we have a section which is called Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. And this is divided into, let's see, 3 sections, or 3 excerpts, or 3 shows. So the first is called Behind the Scenes. This is from 1971. And this is from New York, WNET. And this is A Great American Dream Machine. As I say, approximately 20 minutes. This is footage taken in Mexico, where this film was shot, in Durango, Mexico. And we have Sidney Poitier and also Harry Belafonte featured behind the scenes making of the film. And also, we also have some discussion about, again, from their perspective and their vantage point, and also the significance of the film, both in terms of the production values and also in terms of the social, political, and cultural significance. So it's a great behind-the-scenes, contemporary look and take in terms of the making of this film, and you see the directorial choices, you see the environment, the settings in the background, and the props and the costumes, etc. So it's a really illuminating work and piece. So please check this out if you can. So that's one component of this supplement section, Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. The second component is the program Soul, and this is 1972, approximately 27 minutes. This is also to coincide with the release of the film. And we have Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier sitting with the host. And again, they're talking about their very, I think, honest and direct and upfront reasonings for wanting to make this film. And they do not shy away from talking about the political implications that they try to include and incorporate in terms of making this film, Buck and the Preacher. And so and Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte then give their reasons and give their readings in terms of how this film fits into the overall context of the history of Hollywood cinema, and thus, by extension, the history of American cinema. So this is, I think, a very, very honest and very refreshing discussion with the filmmakers and artists here. And again, it's also showing the camaraderie between Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. And also, it's just great to hear more of their perspective any chance we get. So this is the program Soul from 1972, again, totaling 27 minutes. But then the third subcomponent of this supplement here is the Dick Cavett Show from 1972. This is approximately an hour and 4 minutes. And this is, again, with guests Harry Belafonte at the start, and then later Sidney Poitier joins. So we have Dick Cavett Show, the talk show. And the first component with Harry Belafonte is focusing in on the inspiration for Buck and the Preacher. Again, allowing for discussion of a social political context from the viewpoint of Harry Belafonte, and indeed Sidney Poitier, when he joins in the second half or the latter half, he also shares his perspective from that vantage point. And also there are some details of the production that Dick Cavett talks about. For instance, the look of the preacher. There is this rugged, almost wild look that is very remarkable and striking, especially because, as Dick Cavett describes, Harry Belafonte is a strikingly handsome individual, and the preacher is very striking in terms of the roughness of the look and visage and feel, and even down to the dirt that can be found, or the stains that can be found on the teeth. And so this provides a great anecdote in terms of what Harry Belafonte did in terms of how he was able to discover the staining of the teeth and how he was able to preserve that, and how this became such a key component of the character. And this also is a way in which he and Dick Cavett are talking about these elements of the of sort of makeup and design, how they form the basis of the performance. And this also leads way to a discussion of the craft of acting. Marlon Brando is mentioned, etc. So great entry, great segue into this discussion in terms of the craft and production details. And also Sidney Poitier, when he is part of the talk show program in the latter half, and similar thing in terms of his preparation and his approach to the role, and also his background as an actor. So some details emerge that are very interestingly approached by Dick Cavett, let me put it that way. And it's always very illuminating and engaging with these two great guests, again, Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, in the Dick Cavett Show appearance here from 1972. This is, again, totaling an hour and 4 minutes approximately. So, but that's not all, because then we get the discussion from Gina Belafonte. This is described as being from 2022, approximately 13 minutes. And she's talking about her father, Harry Belafonte, and again, more background in the career of Harry Belafonte at the American Negro Theater, and meeting people like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and Sidney Poitier, and also how this, through a set of circumstances that are really fascinating, how this transitioned into his very, very famous and very successful career as a singer. And he was also very modest, and perhaps even he was very modest about his position as an actor and as a singer. So, and this anecdote is revealed by Gina Belafonte in a very affectionate way. And also how Harry Belafonte placed such emphasis and importance in terms of American civil rights, and his meeting with Dr. King, and also his meeting with Paul Robeson, and how he tried, therefore, to use his art as a way of, say, promoting certain values of American civil rights. So, and then this leads into a discussion of Buck and the Preacher, and the sort of, again, the social, political, and cultural significance of many of the story arcs and themes of Buck and the Preacher, very much reflective of the personal and political interests of Harry Belafonte. So, as described by Gina Belafonte here. And also she discusses too the portrayal by Julie Robinson Belafonte, the mother of the character of Sensei, which was again mentioned a little bit in the Mia Mask interview. And also this idea that's mentioned here, this relationship, again, uneasy one, between the Native American population characters and also the African American population characters in this film, and then the reference to quote-unquote buffalo soldiers and the like. Again, just as discussed in the Dick Cavett Show appearance, she talks here about how Harry Belafonte, her father, discovered the look of the preacher, the hair and the teeth, and the staining of the teeth using black eyeliner. And I think Harry Belafonte also mentions this too, of his wife's black eyeliner pencil he used to stain the teeth. And there is a little system that he used in order to prevent the saliva from touching the teeth, so it would allow to dry, and then putting some kind of film or enamel or covering over, a clear covering over the teeth in order to keep the staining from melting off the teeth or melting off the surface. So a really fascinating process in terms of that. Again, some of the externalities of the performance really informing the internal process of the performance itself. So a very great discussion indeed with Gina Belafonte. Again, this is approximately 13 minutes from the year 2022. And now let's look at the packaging presentation as well as the insert. So let's look at this again. I love this cover art. This is really great. The font and the drawing and the perspective and these are legends, and they're presented in that way. And the aspect of the West and the Western, the rugged nature of the environment, and the look and feel of these larger than life characters as embodied in this drawing or this artistic depiction, and the font use, etc. Great stuff. I love it. The art is credited to art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, illustration Sean Phillips, designer Eric Skillman. So just take a look here, the cover art, and then the back, and then sorry about that, just the back is here, and then you open it up. The leaflet will go here, but then you have the disc. I just wanted to take this disc out just to show that great drawing that's shown in the inside here. Really wonderful stuff. And of course the disc art itself on the actual disc itself. So that is the cover art design, and also the inner design, and also the back. And that cover art design is, or that aesthetic, I think, is carried over here with this great leaflet, which represents certain aspects of the film in terms of the bounty of the reward, as well as the font use that has that Western aesthetic, as well as some pictures or stills that also have this Western aesthetic, this sort of sepia tone look. I'm not a fan of the fold out, I've said many times, but the paper use here has a nice high quality, and I love the sepia tone. It has that sense of the aged paper to remind us of the Western times that we are dealing with. And also, we have the great essay, Aisha Harris, Unsettled Land. Another great essay here. Again, watch the film first. That's my strong suggestion. And then you can read the essay. This is the Unsettled Land essay. Again, we have the great discussion of the production history leading up to 1972 and leading up to the great collaboration between these two artists, as well as some of the political dealings between artists and the studio, as well as the thematic concerns and the discussions and analytical points raised in terms of the essay and the film itself. Really great stuff. Unsettled Land. I love this essay. Please check it out if you can. It's another great example from the Criterion collection. So with that, that's the presentation of the film from Criterion. There's no commentary track to my knowledge, at least as I couldn't find any commentary track. It would have been so great to have a commentary track, for instance, from Mia Mask or another scholar. But oh well. What we do get in terms of the supplements, it's really great. And then, of course, we have the film itself. And as I say, it's a film with multi-levels. And one of the levels is as a thoroughly entertaining film with some brilliant performances from Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte, who are Buck and the Preacher. Okay, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.